Okay. So, I mean, as I said before, it was a really interesting prospect, this opportunity to talk in Hong Kong under these specific conditions, but it was almost so important for me because of so much of the work that I do is sort of research-based and sometimes very solitary, that the opportunity to communicate with you all today would be one where I would try and be as extroverted as possible. So to talk as a conversation, and I hope that equally when it comes to the conversation, you're all able to engage and ask whatever questions you may have. So I decided to just focus on two exhibitions that I haven't really been directly involved in, but that through sort of invitation, as that often happens when you're curating independently, invitations to collaborate, to kind of have conversations, to conduct research in the run-up to what are two, I think, pretty interesting biennales insofar as they both took place in the year 2015, they both took place in Italy, and I think they both would be considered to have kind of sort of hallmark positions in a kind of canon of thinking about biennales or cultural festivals. The first of which was Milan Expo, which I worked on upon receiving an invitation from Germano Cilent to write an essay on contemporary art and post-colonialism in relation to food, which was unique. And then soon after to work with Osei Bonsu in the run-up to All the World's Futures, which was an exhibition that was really at the same time starting to form around a set of tensions and a set of questions that he'd been having conversations, but that hadn't really formed in any kind of thematic structure. And I guess the kind of outcome of this talk will hopefully be, what does it mean to curate a biennale around a specific theme versus maybe a set of concerns or tensions that feel sometimes more urgent, because sometimes the problem with thematic exhibitions is that you can become so locked into whatever that thematic structure may be that it then dictates the structure of the exhibition and in turn the kind of art you're able to support and facilitate. So the first image is a particularly important one in the genesis of the Venice Biennale for this year, the 56th edition, titled All the World's Futures. It's actually an image of the Venice Biennale, a kind of collateral event that would have taken place in 1974. Or three, rather. So following a major restructuring and revisioning of the rules and articles of the Constitution, this launched a kind of unprecedented search into the sort of activities that the Biennale could be doing to kind of politicize its wider sort of outreach. And in doing so, at that particular moment in time, it decided to look at Chile as a point of sort of interest. At that time, there had just been a Chilean coup d'etat that was a sort of watershed event both for Chile and for the Cold War period. And I'm going to read it sort of as it's been reported because it makes more sense. That the military was replaced by the Unidad Popular government that was established Junta de Jopiero that suspended all political activity in the country and repressed left-wing movements, especially communist and socialist parties. And that for Osei, that particular point of interest really came as a kind of an interesting point at which you saw the intersection of the Biennale and society. So he remarked that it had foregrounded a gesture of solidarity in the aftermath of this coup d'etat, in which General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the government of Salvador Allende. In the constitution and restructuring of its programs, and that year students, activists, trade unionists, and the public at large got much more involved in the Biennale as a direct result of that political initiative. So in addition to that, you also have another historically important development for the Biennale, this year's Biennale, and I'm calling it the kind of political fabric out of which then the Biennale was sort of spun. So you have, in 1988, a direct challenge towards the notion of Venice Biennale as a kind of all-seeing sort of global exhibition that would reflect, that would host within it these sort of foreign sort of, modes of display, and that those would be kind of concessions within a wider theme, was seen as unpopular at the time because, abstract expressionism had started to dictate a form of sort of white cube visual structure that seemed maybe more consistent with some of the ideas that were being had in relation to exhibitions and how they should be displayed. But that's only to say it's relevant insofar as thinking about this Biennale. Like, it's impossible to give an overarching history of the Venice Biennale, but to just talk about the moments that may have been key in triggering an exhibition like All the World's Futures. So that moving on from then, you had these conditions of display which began to shift. What interests me is that then between that time of 1988 and 2015, where we are now, you had the emergence of the black box as a mode of display, but also grey spaces that we now define as those for live art and performance. So incredibly key in the sense that they bring us towards seeing this kind of expanded view of a Biennale that when it would have started, would have had an incredibly fixed somehow notion of how it reflected the wider world, but in a sense was always an international exhibition, or at least that's how it kind of advertised itself. So when we presented this Biennale, one of the issues for me immediately became the fact that I was already doing research on Marinetti and the Futurists for Arts and Foods, which was the exhibition going on in La Triennale in Milan. And basically what became apparent is that the exhibition had already pitched itself as this is a quote, that will employ a historical trajectory of the Biennale itself. The core of the project will be the notion of the exhibition as a stage where historical and counter-historical projects will be explored. But in that exploration, there are obviously omissions. There are obviously certain missing links, one of which is the problematic history of the Biennale in relation to the fascist propaganda that took place between 1928 and 1942, and between the politics and collaborations of the Italian futurist F.T. Marinetti, and Benito Mussolini's fascist, National Fascist Party. So those were kind of an interesting fertile ground because they weren't really being covered in the expo because there would have been no reason to really think about them in relation to the history of art and food, although the Futurists had a very particular position. The politics of that were skirted over, and I'll get into more details about how working on that exhibition and actually thinking about the post-colonial narrative in relation to it was a key sort of trigger for bringing in new content that just wasn't present within that particular exhibition structure. So the kind of map for All the World's Futures then became this way of looking at a history, very much an exhibition as a tool for history making, but also as a way for readdressing or returning to certain important key issues which I've highlighted in history that may be unresolved or may be somehow contentious. However, I've already identified one that wasn't covered at all in the Biennale's sort of literature. So sort of when we're talking about then how that exhibition unfolded further, I'm just using a quote from the press conference when Onweza himself was recorded as having said, "We live in incredible times," and I think this is the most telling of anything that's really been said about the Biennale in one kind of foul swoop, because there's a lot of kind of hyperbole and a great deal of verbalage that comes with talking around an exhibition before it happens. It's incredibly difficult to articulate what you're going to do before you do it. So I go back to the quote, "We live in incredible times, and at times this incredulity has no solution, and therefore we have hope." And I think that on a very baser level sort of brings us quite nicely into some of the direct sort of political concerns that pervaded that exhibition. So this proclamation, at such a relatively early stage, this was actually being said before artists had been sort of selected, or not all the artists had been brought into the fold. Already made it quite clear what the direction of the Biennale would be, but also in addition to this, the formation of filters through which to think about the curator's central preoccupation became a kind of interest for everyone who is working on and towards the project. So it was already clear that in the fold of the Venice Biennale, and I'll move on to the opening image of the Biennale, we can talk about this kind of notion of a kind of dense, restless, exploratory project that would be sort of located in this dialectical field. And I guess what was interesting from that perspective is the potential for that dialectical field to liberate new possibilities for both kind of form and function of contemporary art, because we'd known the Biennale to be kind of either strongly thematic or leaning towards the encyclopedic, or indeed making an irony out of that idea of being an encyclopedic project, that it seemed that there was nowhere else to go. So I was kind of curious to know how that kind of dialectical field would play out. But anyway, so immediately, the idea became the curator himself, along with artists, activists, the public, contributors, of which there were many, of all skills will appear as central protagonists in the orchestration of the project. It would be in search of a language and a method of exhibition making that would ultimately settle on the visual, the somatic, the oral, and the narrative event. So it's still these incredibly broad ways of defining ways of making exhibitions about history, but still getting quite a bit closer to what it might mean to make an exhibition that deals with a lot of the concerns I mentioned earlier. So when we move then into this notion of the filters, in this particular work, it's kind of beyond recollection now, because there is so much work being presented in Venice that I'm sure even for those of you who visit, you're already getting a kind of amnesia and having blind spots and blackouts. But for me, it's always interesting to think about how sort of key works sort of certainly postulated a position as liberating the direct political potential of the Biennale, this being one of them. But I was thinking about the exact functions of each of these filters, which I mentioned earlier, and they all ended up becoming something quite different. And I say this as someone who worked on the development, but really more so was a participant and was active in looking at the Biennale. This Garden of Disorder, which was the first kind of proposition to be made around what the space of the Giardini, which was the first site for the international exhibition, might be. And in thinking about that, this notion of residue came up, and this was particularly relevant in relation to a kind of residues whose shards and fragments would create a molecular density from which we would build, if not rebuild. And I think that there was something kind of compelling about the notion of building in relation to that as a kind of, not only a collectivist project, but one that did refer directly to the, you could even argue slightly communist roots, quite literally, of the political premise that was set by that particular moment of 1973. So there we have an exhibition unfolding, and it was inspired by the notion of what a garden might have meant in Persian antiquity, where the garden ultimately derives from. The second filter, which was, this is the entry point to the arena, and at the front you see Glenn Ligon's, sort of overbearing neon lights, and then Oscar Murillo's very dense, very raw materials, which are kind of draped. And that, to use that as a facade is already a kind of foreboding way, because usually that entrance is kept relatively clean. At least for architecture, it's kept very clean, with much more respect for the facade, because it somehow means more. And I think that there is something in that kind of that agitation, or there's certainly a kind of political antagonism in the need for a curator to disrupt a status quo, if indeed they wish to rewrite history, which is exactly what we're talking about in the context of this particular talk. So the second filter would be about reading capital, and I'm not going to talk about that in too much detail, only because it is the reason many people left the Biennale scratching their heads. But I will say that the way it was kind of posited is as the great drama of our age, looming as something larger than life, really, or rather being life, the situation within which now people are born into. They effectively are part of this kind of grand narrative, and that through thinking about that particular sequence, the work of Karl Marx, The Massive Capital, Critique on Political Economy, published in 1867, would be read again and again on a loop by various people, also performed, choreographed, danced. It would be a real kind of living text, a living sort of breathing text in which all manners of people could contribute, because indeed this wasn't necessarily about the production of art making per se, but about the kind of production of knowledge, or what could be generated through repetition or revisitation. And what's so interesting is how old that text is. I mean, to bring such a kind of an old school piece of literature into a contemporary art exhibition, there is already an immediate rupture that one has to think about then the broader implications for contemporary artists working under those conditions. Although I'm not sure whether it was a concern for every artist participating, and that's something we could talk about more. And then the idea of the exhibition as a parliament of forms, which is the one that for me, it wasn't a filter, but it was kind of more of an idea, is still incredibly compelling, only because I really like those two words coupled alongside one another, what it might mean to produce a parliament of forms, or what might constitute a parliament of forms in an age where we're constantly thinking about what constitutes a modernity, and that certainly in relation to thinking about All the World's Futures as a project that would also be implicated in the post-war, there were very many artists who were ultimately, who would have been formed more so by those politics than those of maybe capital or late capitalism. So it was kind of interesting how you had this kind of friction between capitalistic production, industrial production, and a kind of the collectivist potentiality of the immediate present. And that's such a rich place for an art exhibition to begin, even without there being any art yet. You know, it's a kind of real smorgasbord of potential. So rather than an overreaching theme, it would encapsulate diverse forms of practice and one unified field of vision, which I think this is where it starts to get difficult, because actually finding a unified field of vision for practices that are going to sit within those filters that I mentioned has its own complications. But I'll move further into the kind of site specificity of the Biennale. So this is how it was communicated in its kind of early press release. 100 years after the first shots of the First World War were fired in 1914, and 75 years after the beginning of the Second World War in 1939, the global landscape again lies shattered and in disarray, shattered by violent turmoil, panicked by the specters of economic crisis and viral pandemonium, successionist politics, humanitarian catastrophe on the high seas, deserts, and borderlands, as migrants, refugees, and desperate people seek refuge in seemingly calmer and more prosperous lands. Everywhere one turns, a new crisis, which kind of makes us think about the presentation that Brian was making yesterday. Everyone turns to a new crisis, uncertainty, and the deepening insecurity and loss of regions of the world seem to leap into view. So this idea of things seeming to leap into view is incredibly important, because, like I mentioned before, what does it mean to create an exhibition that can come out of a certain urgency and that can form concepts and maybe answer questions as often as it kind of posits them? And I think that one of the really interesting moments is when the Biennale opened and you actually saw the engagement with the works. But for now, I'm going to move further into the actual experience of visiting the space itself. So it's not, I mean, for many of you, I'm sure you will have visited, maybe if this not this edition, another edition. But I think what's particularly curious about this particular edition of the Venice is the way it kind of reconstituted the architecture of the location, and the extent to which the outcomes, the spatial outcomes of re-envisioning a form of biennale making, which is now a kind of craft within itself. I mean, we talk about exhibition making, but I think many people who have institutional practices that are tethered to spaces, it's still quite difficult to comprehend what it would mean to work in an entirely sort of carte blanche way in terms of looking across a city or looking across a very sort of an urban space, as was presented yesterday in one of the presentations by Chitty, on the notion of having to introduce content to urban forms or to spaces where you might not expect to see that work. Not that Venice is necessarily urban, but certainly there is a need to, I guess, get people to rethink the space in a way that they wouldn't otherwise, I guess viewing it as tourists, as many of us do before we visit as guests of the Biennale. So in this particular image, you see the live reading of Das Kapital, and you see the audience consuming the text and hopefully engaging with it and taking an interest. One of the interesting things about that moment in which the exhibition slipped into a performative space, you saw a kind of differentiation between the types of audiences that were engaging in the Biennale on different levels. And it certainly, I guess, in terms of it not only being visual, having other aspects that were also live, performed, mediated, meant that there were different channels by which you could receive information through the Biennale. So the visual wasn't the only streamline, so to speak. I finally found the list of artists. So the first work that you saw was by, and I should take it back slightly, was by Walid Beshti, obviously. The next work, which I mentioned, is Oscar Murillo and Glenn Ligon. It's not so relevant you observe the work, only because typically I wouldn't show artworks in their kind of pure form as slides, only because it's so hard to represent these particular works. But I think installation views, I hope, give you a sense of what was mentioned in the last presentation, which was the notion of juxtaposition, how things play off one another, which is always a really interesting challenge when you're working with installation, because inevitably nature becomes a kind of component, it becomes a player. The other work that I mentioned is an installation view of the arena curated by, or rather constructed by David Adjaye, the British Ghanaian architect. The next work, which was an incredibly popular work, if you were kind of moving through the space, is by Katrina Gross, and it was entitled Trumpet, and that was again in the space as you walk through the Arsenale, a kind of conjoining space. And I think that's also an interesting thing, this idea of, as well as seeing these spaces as filters, you could see them as kind of portals. And that was mentioned also in Chitty's talk yesterday about ways of gaining entry into another way of understanding, which I think are really helpful in terms of thinking about exhibitions of modes for rewriting history, because it's almost this sense that you have to locate someone somewhere before you take them anywhere. And I think that with exhibitions, often the challenge of telling a narrative, a historical narrative, especially if you're trying to gain or trying to kind of represent some kind of objectivity, can be incredibly challenging, particularly when that viewer may have no point of reference. So that yet another work that was part of the main presentation by Sakip Sapanki. And then you move on to, this room in particular is interesting to me because the artists are kind of all showing at once, and I guess you don't see a sense of juxtaposition so much as you do a presentation of forms, a parliament of forms. You have Jason Moran towards the end, Sonia Gomez kind of trailing down the pillar, and then Laval Monroe, the Trinidadian artist, on the further wall. So that kind of brings all the world's futures to a close as a topic, and I say it with relative caution of somehow misrepresenting what is such a complex and still kind of growing and morphing exhibition, but kind of wanting to maybe probe how that exhibition may be useful insofar as meeting the aims of this particular panel, which was to discuss exhibitions as rewriting history. So we now move back to a different time. A different moment, I guess, a different way of thinking about the world that in my hometown of London would have been pretty much the only way you could experience it. And this was the first World Expo, I guess, is registered as such. And the reason it's relevant insofar looking at the next project, which actually occurred maybe a month before the Venice Biennale opened, but it was Germano Cilent's, I think, super interesting exhibition on arts and food that looked at really the breadth and depth of art and food as a kind of, not only an aesthetic category, but an activity, a form of kind of posturing and making sense of situations. So when the proposal came to Germano, I presume he thought it would be interesting to look at this year of 1851, the year of the London Expo, and the year in which this was presented at Crystal Palace. A really, really brief history of what this might have had in it. It would have had a kind of Belgian hall, an India hall. You see all of the flags representing each space, and it would have effectively facilitated for Britain a kind of gateway into the trade and commodities of these specific places. So kind of hardware was a huge part of the first expo, and it was a way of obviously increasing trade, but also, like I said, an exhibition that would work with the industries of all nations. So that you had that exhibition that took place in Crystal Palace, and was the architect was Joseph Paxton, very different architect to David Adjaye, very different moment in time. World fairs dealing with raw materials, manufactures, works of art, and was obviously instituted by Queen Victoria. So I think that when looking at that, I mean, it's not a particularly relevant example for me, but it gave a kind of point of departure for Germano to look at the periods in which the discourse on art and food has expanded. And I guess that those periods go from sort of that exact time, which is the sort of 1850s, expanding into what would have been sort of forms of still life, still very painterly representations, and kind of a lot of ephemera or material that would have dealt with kind of excavating a history of how people might have lived and ate at different points, and then moving into a very different space, which is more consistent with Germano's curatorial trajectory, which is the space of contemporary art. And what's really interesting about, it is really interesting about Germano's kind of take on looking at arts and food, and including this work by Dennis Hoppenheim, which is in conversation with works by Andreas Gersi, 99 Cent, and also Bread House by Urs Fischer, which you'll see in a later slide, was kind of this very, I don't know, I guess you could say it's a pop aesthetic in the sense that it leads us to see a kind of stream of images more than it does kind of force us into thinking about the politics of the representation of things, which was such a strong point for All the World's Futures. And I wonder whether, in terms of writing history, whether you actually need a text in order to do that, or whether artworks can be stand-ins for bodies of knowledge and information. But moving on, because I'm running out of time. We're looking at other works by Frank Gehry, which are, I mean, really interesting examples in the sense of how you see a coalescence of art and design. And I think kind of significant to Germano's own biography, that was always a point of inquiry, but it's becoming, I'm not sure what it's like here in Hong Kong, but it's increasingly rare that you're seeing curators work across the disciplines of art and design with such fluidity. It tends to be that one specializes academically in one category or another. I certainly don't have any kind of design affiliations, but it's so fascinating to see a curator work with both simultaneously. So in terms of what the exhibition tried to do, a global panorama of interwoven aesthetics that would focus on eating rituals. It would be an international exhibition that would use a variety of media to express various forms. But I think one of the points that I just want to emphasize is how it positioned certain artistic movements. I wouldn't say in a hierarchical way, but in a way that forced us to think about these positions of images in time and the representations that they may have had. Because when you're talking about arts and foods in relation to a global exhibition, you are very much talking about an exhibition that then has to represent the countries that were present in the expo. I think there was only one Indian artist or Southeast Asian artist involved in this particular exhibition. So you have to wonder the extent to which they're representative, but also it's no one's responsibility to police that. I guess it's up to the curator to figure out how to best represent the pluralities of the times in which we live. So the avant-garde movements that would be implicated would include pointillism, as I mentioned earlier. It would move into kind of more avant-garde movements, and then it would end in pop. But pop was really the lens through which I think the whole exhibition was shot rather cinematically. And I would say that what's interesting is that you had an intertwinement of a kind of NGO way of thinking about nourishment, feeding the planet, global aid, and then this kind of wacky contemporary art exhibition taking a course alongside that, because obviously Expo is also a world fair in which various NGOs come together to share information on various subjects. In this particular instance, it was focused on food. The next expo will take place in Dubai. If any of you are interested, I'm sure it will come with another mammoth exhibition. So you've got another work there by Marisa Mertz, and finally a work by Tom Friedman, coupled by a work by Iled Lasseri and Yinka Shonibari. And the reason I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of Yinka Shonibari in relation to this is that I had to talk about the space of post-colonialism in contemporary art and then somehow address food in doing that. And you realize that there is a very short number of artists who've actually worked within that space. But when you do crack it open, you realize it's an incredibly contentious one, because what I was able to find out is that there was a direct relation between kind of the proponents of the Black British art movement of the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, and then practitioners that had worked kind of in modes of still life in order to use representation as a form of kind of political, I wouldn't say political action as such, but certainly as a political gesture. So in the paragraph where I wrote about this particular instance, and I'll read some of it, this was kind of the way in which I figured food was working in the space of this exhibition and kind of after post-colonial discourse. Food has become a floating signifier for a wider conversation about post-colonial memory and trauma, but also the desire to reinvent civilization in the image of an imagined historical canon. Food can be taken to be a thing of desire, capable of traveling through cultures and languages and visual worlds as it accumulates contradictory meanings and divergent subtexts. Whether framed within the domestic, the religious, or the sexualized setting, it has been and continues to be one of the most effective tools for the reconstitution of cultural identity. While the conjectures of wealth and abundance seen in the archaic feasts and the empires past remind us that the fortune of so many is so often the devastation of others, the fetishized food objects encased within the subtle exoticism of the still life painting evoke an exotic fascination with Europe's primitive foundation. One can only evoke the same feelings of desire and rage which can evoke the same feelings of desire and rage one might share in a dialogue at the edge of a dining room table. And that was in relation to the fact that the work included a lot of tables and a lot of sort of settings in which people might have these conversations. And one of the works that was addressed in that essay was by a Black British artist called Lubaina Himid, who's dealt a lot with notions of kind of colonialism, but in a casual context. So what those might mean in relation to kind of a common thread and a common sort of condition. So we end with such images are lit by the theatrical glow of the historical present, and that's really a strong, that's the glow that illuminates Venice, and it's the same glow that will dim and illuminate the next thing the minute Venice is no longer running. Such images are lit by the theatrical glow of the historical present. Instead of engaging in the perpetual representation of European aesthetics in this case, what I argued for is that they stage subjects of modern life that expose the apparent conjuncture of civilization and the unrepresentable self. So the way in which there is kind of no room for, I would say, a kind of a strong form of subjectivity within exhibitions that are trying to posit a historical narrative. And that brings me to the end of the presentation, but I just wanted to share a final few thoughts, or rather questions for thinking about these two models, and I'd be curious to hear from you all later about whether you think that biennales are a space to act upon narratives of history, whether they can be productive insofar as them being incredibly temporal, quite difficult to contain, but also sometimes laden with a kind of discourse that can make them incomprehensible to the people trying to penetrate them. And I'd wonder whether either example strikes you as more useful in that way, but more than that, to think about the kind of potentiality of another form of exhibition making that may rise out of what maybe was mentioned at the beginning of All the World's Futures, but can't go on because the exhibition has to end, which is a kind of kind of to circumscribe these very values within very kind of static communities, but within one's own community. So as opposed to thinking of them so much on the global scale, through the World Expo, Milan Expo, and these exhibitions that become incredibly far-reaching, to think of them as very, very specific points from which to have a dialectical exchange about our times. So I think that just about covers it. And I'm not sure that there is anything else that I want to say, but There may be, so hold on. One of the things I was going to mention is you can't discount the importance of both curators' biographies in relation to what has been produced. Both sort of Germano Cilant and Orkney Weso have had incredibly rich relationships with artists, and I argue that one of the reasons they were able to remain so consistent in their retelling of a historical narrative, not so much in Orkney's case, but it did at times feel like it was very embedded in a certain one side of history. That I'm sure that has to do with understanding artists very well, and one of the things that I'm so aware of is that when it comes to these particular examples, I'm not necessarily sure that there needed to be as many works, or that it would have been more effective to have artists take more control of the situation, and to what extent curating things by committee is kind of useful in terms of telling a historical narrative that can be both poetic and subjective all at once, can be both micro and macro. So anyway, thanks so much for listening. Thank you.